Good evening, gentlemen. When we start learning, we are going to be starting on 927 in the English, by the way. Page 927 is where we're holding. We are well into the second half of chapter 7 of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. We first discussed in this chapter the way in which the worlds not only do not exist separately from God, but they have no importance of their own, no inherent worth to God. In other words, not only is the world nothing other than its source, but the source of the world is absolutely one with God, absolutely one, absolutely united with Him. It is nothing other than Him. Right? And therefore, when He creates the world, it's ani havaya le shanisi. He has not changed by the creation of the world. And not only that, but His knowledge is also not changed by the creation of the world, as we've discussed. His knowledge of the world before He creates it and after He creates it is exactly the same. His knowledge has not changed. And then we come to what we began to study last week. And what I said was I would really rather do 1 3-hour class rather than 3 1-hour classes. So now we have our second 1-hour class of the theoretical and yet impossible 3-hour class. We have our second hour now on this topic which is really a bit difficult, which is the idea of Tzimtzum enoi k'pshutai. The Tzimtzum, the contraction of God's light. When God removes His light to create the world, the removal of the light is non-literal. As we began to discuss last week, we said, what would it mean for Him to literally remove His light? So we explained that the Arizal introduced, the Holy Ari, introduced to Kabbalah the idea of what's called Tzimtzum Harishain, the original or primordial Tzimtzum, the original contraction and removal of His light. What does the Arizal say? He says, in the beginning there was only He and His light, and His light filled all that there was to be. It was the only thing in all of existence. And then God decided that He wanted to make a universe, He wanted to make a world, so He removed His light to the side, and He shone in one ray of the original light, and that ray became the universe. Now the Tzimtzum is the part of this story where He moves His light to the side. He removes His expression. He removes His presence to leave an empty space. And only after doing that does He then create the universe in the empty space. There are two general ways to understand this Tzimtzum. Well, there's two, as we're going to discuss today. Really, it depends on why the Tzimtzum is necessary in the first place, is really what the disagreement is about. But there's two ways to understand the removal of this light. The way that God removed his light, removed His expression, and left an empty space, so to speak, for the world. The literal way to understand this is that there was no room for a universe when God's light was there. In other words, as we discussed at length last week, everything physical and everything spiritual takes up a certain space. Right? It takes up, it has a location, it has a geder or a tchum, it has an area that defines it, whether that area is spiritual or physical. And in fact, the simplest way to see that everything has its own area is that the spiritual things are not physical, and the physical things are not spiritual, right? In other words, the very fact that these things, that there even is such a thing as spiritual versus physical, shows that each one has their tchum, each one has their area, it has their defined realm in which they exist. Physically, this is very easy for us to understand, because our minds think very physically, but spiritually, in a more abstract, refined way, there's also the idea of something taking up spiritual space, that something exists within a certain area or it has a certain realm in the spiritual sense. And to understand the Tzimtzum literally, to understand the literal removal of God's light, is to say that His light took up all the space spiritually, all the conceptual space. There was no room for someone else, right? We mean in a spiritual sense, like the way we say, there's no room for that kind of talk here. There's no room to say such a thing, right? So similarly speaking, before God removed his light, there was no room for a universe, for anything other than him to exist. Because what is God's light really? We didn't discuss this as much as we should last week, but I'll just say a word about it here, and we'll discuss it more going further. What is God's light really? Obviously not a physical light. God's light is what we say, it's shlemusa de kula. It's the perfection of everything. In other words, it is the presence, the expression of everything that God is God's light. There's him, there is his expression, which is his perfect expression, his infinite expression, which expresses everything that he is. And in a place where God is fully expressed, where God's presence is fully felt, how can there be room for anything else to exist in that space? How can there be room, spiritually or physically, for anything else to be where God's light is? And so we have a literal tzimtzum. God takes his light, he removes it, the light is gone, and now there is room for a universe to be created, which he creates with the Kav, the single ray of light, and that's the story of the Arizal. The Alter Rebbe does not hold of this opinion. This opinion is held of by others, including very famously the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, Rabbi Yoel of Vilna, who was one of the main opponents of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus in his time. To what extent and in what way he was actually an opponent, etc., is all very interesting, juicy matters of historical debate and historical record, etc. You can get into the whole story of the Alter Rebbe and the opponents of the Alter Rebbe's Chassidus, which of course eventually ends up with him being jailed in the famous and then released in the famous story of Yutas Kislev, etc., etc. The whole thing is connected. But the opponents of the Alter Rebbe, or we should say rather the interlocutors, the people with whom the Alter Rebbe, to whom the Alter Rebbe addresses this part of Tanya, right? He says there are people who make a mistake in understanding the Tzimtzum, right? All of these people who think that the Tzimtzum is literal. Right? The Alter Rebbe disagrees with them. And he explains why. We read the reasons why last week, for two reasons. Number one, because the literal tzimtzum is mimikre haguf. The literal tzimtzum is implying in a very subtle way that God has bodily traits. How did we explain that? Why does this literal tzimtzum imply bodily traits? Because what it essentially says is that God's infinite expression takes up space, that it is defined in space just as other spiritual existences or physical existences are defined in space. And what this must mean, if God's presence is defined in space, is that somehow the space comes before God's presence. God's presence is dependent on space, like everything else that has a body, whether a spiritual body or a physical body, right? Whether a spiritual space-taking mechanism or a physical space-taking mechanism or aspect, right? You're saying that God essentially takes up space. And the question is why would we assume such a thing? It would seem space hasn't even been created yet. You would assume the whole notion of space.
What brought them into that conclusion?
Which?
That space existed before God.
No. They would not explicitly have been brought to that conclusion. In other words, the people with whom the Alter Rebbe disagrees would not say that this is their interpretation. In other words, this is a disagreement. The Alter Rebbe is saying, they don't say that space comes before God. God forbid. They wouldn't say that because that's against the Ikari Emunah of Judaism, right? It's against the principles of faith of Judaism. God obviously doesn't have a body or anything like a body. What the Alter Rebbe is saying is that implicit in your position that the Tzimtzum is literal, this is like Mikre Haguf. This is like saying, because you say that, therefore we must say that God has something like a body. In other words, God's expression exists within space. And the truth is that the Arizal himself mentions that God's light takes up space, etc. In other words, this isn't necessarily such a terribly mistaken view. The Alter Rebbe is saying that it in conclusion, though, in other words, once you work out what the Arizal means, if you conclude that what it means is that God takes up space in the way that God's expression takes up space, God's light takes up space in the way that all spiritual existences take up space, you're really attributing to Hashem a bodily aspect more than we need to, more than is necessary. Why attribute to God this bodily notion? Clearly, it's the Tzimtzum is non-literal, is the first point of the Alter Rebbe.
But no, why not saying that the God himself is actually the space, and he takes a space in himself?
God himself is not a space, right? God is God, he's not a space.
Of course, I mean,
right.
the only way to describe God is God.
Right.
But, but the space is actually part of it.
Well, the reason why you can't say that's interesting because that touches on what we're going to discuss in tonight's class, God willing. But the reason why is because how are we defining space, right? It all depends on how you define it. What do we mean by space? We mean a space that if it's filled by God's presence, other things can't be there. So in other words, we're saying the spaces are in some way comparable if you read the Tzimtzum literally. In other words, it's a whole worldview on the Tzimtzum. Why does God need to make a Tzimtzum? Because he needs to make room for other things to exist. To which the Alter Rebbe is saying what that means is what's inescapable in that explanation is that the type of room or space that God's presence takes up is the same type that would get in the way of the universe taking up that space, if you understand what I'm saying. So in other words, you could conjecture if you wanted some sort of higher space, but it doesn't solve the problem because the whole issue is, the whole point of the Tzimtzum is because he wanted to have a universe, so he made a Tzimtzum. So if it's a space-making measure, as it is in the literal Tzimtzum, that must mean they share in some sense, maybe in a very refined way, but they share some notion of space, if that's the explanation, is basically what the Alter Rebbe is saying. Then he says a second point. He says a second reason why the literal Tzimtzum, the literal removal of God's light, is not correct, is because it contradicts what we have already learned in our chapter about God's knowledge, which is that God, from the Rambam, right, which we quoted from Maimonides, that God and his knowledge, the knower, the knowledge, and the known, are all absolutely one. In which case, the entire effect of the literal Tzimtzum, which is to say that God, as we quoted last week, that God looks down at the world like a king from his tower looking upon a lowly place, right? The whole notion that God is removed from the world and he looks down at it from outside is not legitimate according to the Alter Rebbe's explanation of God's knowledge. Is not legitimate according to the way that we have explained God's knowledge. Because if he has, which no one disagrees with, all the great rabbis who are parties to this debate agree that God not only knows everything that takes place in the world, but is intimately involved in the world. He's mashgiach, as we would call it, with hashgacha. There is divine providence. He is involved in the happenings of the world, not only knowing them passively, but actually, intervening in the world, being involved in the happenings of the world. Everyone agrees. If that is the case, then we must follow the teaching that we already have, which says that he and his knowledge, the knower and the known, are absolutely one and the same thing. In other words, to put it differently, the thing that God is knowing cannot be outside of him, right? It cannot be outside of Hashem. It cannot be that God is in one place and what is known, which here actually refers to the 10 spheres of Atzilus, but that's a separate, that's just a footnote. God and what is known cannot be two separate things, because he and his knowledge, he and what is known are absolutely one, as we discussed earlier in the chapter, which is at the surface level the reason why this whole discussion is in this chapter, right? All of a sudden we're talking about the Tzimtzum and the contraction of God's light. We say that this seems to be a non sequitur, but really it's not, because what we have just previously learned in the chapter, that God and his knowledge are one, is one of the reasons why the Alter Rebbe feels compelled to reject the literal Tzimtzum, aside logically, right? In other words, arguments for rejecting the literal Tzimtzum, as opposed to his tradition, which he had otherwise, even without arguments. He had a tradition from his teachers and their teachers all the way back to the Arizal, that the Tzimtzum was, as we also mentioned last week, that the Tzimtzum is non-literal. So
the
yeah.
Shema,
Yeah.
Israel, so that one.
Yeah.
What was the earliest known occurrence of that prayer?
Of the Shema? The Shema comes from the Chumash.
from way back.
Yeah.
From the Torah.
Yeah.
And so this notion that God is one
Yeah.
implies that at that point they had this type of understanding.
Well, I would say yes, of course, believing that this understanding goes all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai, and this is the true intention of the pasuk of Shema, referring to Yichud Ilah, the higher level unity, exactly as the Alter Rebbe explains it. Someone who disagrees and would say that it means anything other than exactly the way the Alter Rebbe explains it, would say that it all depends what you mean by one. There's many different ways to understand one, not necessarily. There's other ways. Maybe it just means God is one God as opposed to many. Right, at the simplest reading, right? There's many different things you could read into the psukim, and of course that's how Judaism works, right? There's many shades of meaning, many facets, many interpretations, etc. So when the Alter Rebbe says Shema Yisrael means such and such, there's obviously room, and everybody has, of course, room to disagree, and many people have, many people will, probably. So the two reasons why the Alter Rebbe doesn't accept the literal Tzimtzum are clear. Number one, it's bodily. Number two, or in a very refined way, true, but it's still implying a bodily trait to God, that He and the world His infinite light and the universe take up the same room in some sense. And the second reason why not is because God and His knowledge are one. Therefore, what is known must be totally one with Him. There cannot be any separation between the universe that He knows and Him, exactly as we explained 2 weeks ago, right, with our metaphor of the baseball, and that the ability to throw a baseball implies the ability to throw it in any dimension. And if a new dimension existed tomorrow, a seventh dimension, you would be able to throw the baseball in that way too. That's the way that God knows the universe. In other words, He knows it inherently because that's what His knowledge is. So the very fact that the universe is created makes no difference to His knowledge. So if the Alter Rebbe says, if that's the case, if His knowledge of the universe is absolutely one with Him, then how can you say that God is separate and looking into the universe from the outside because His presence has been totally removed? It doesn't make sense according to that teaching. It doesn't fit with that teaching. And I should just note, not to overcomplicate things too much, but there are other ways to understand the Rambam's teaching as well. In other words, everything the Alter Rebbe is saying is his shita and his approach, and there's room to debate all of this, which is why there's a debate. The Alter Rebbe himself acknowledges there are great rabbis, not people who are ignorant, God forbid, or people whose views are not legitimate. There are great rabbis who view differently. The Alter Rebbe, in his opinion, says that those rabbis are mistaken. This is the incorrect view of what the Arizal was saying, and he proves it with, he demonstrates it, I should say. Really, it's not a proof. The proof is that this is his tradition. That's why the Alter Rebbe believes it. But he demonstrates the 2 points that he would bring against someone who argues the opposite position, is that it's from the literal Tzimtzum implies a bodily nature to God, and it implies that His knowledge is separate from Him when it is really one with Him. Both of which itself could be argued, and probably were argued, with the Alter Rebbe. Both of those points. In other words, there are other ways to look at all of these things. I'm just opening it up to let you know that this is how Torah works, right? Just because Hillel says one thing doesn't mean Shammai doesn't disagree, and it doesn't mean that either view is not Torah. Both of them are Torah, both of them are legitimate interpretations, but this is the Alter Rebbe's shita. This is the approach in Tanya. Now, this week, with the remaining time left to our class, with the remaining time left to our class, I want to discuss, mostly outside of the text, what is the Alter Rebbe's position on the Tzimtzum? What does it mean that the removal of God's light is non-literal? What does this position mean? We mentioned very briefly last week the nakuda, the central point of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The central point of what the Alter Rebbe is saying is as follows, and we're going to spend the next half an hour trying to explain what this means, at least to some extent. The Alter Rebbe says that when the Arizal says that the infinite light of God is removed, the light is not removed. The light remains exactly where it is. The only thing is that it's hidden. The presence of the light is concealed. Present, but hidden. In contrast, again, to what we said before. Before we said the light is not present. God wants to create a universe. He has to remove the light for a universe to be here. The Alter Rebbe's position is he does not have to remove the light for the universe to be here. In fact, the light is still here. It's only that the presence of the light is concealed. It's hidden. That is what the Tzimtzum does. When the Arizal says he removes his light, it is non-literal. He means removes from perception, from experience, that the light is no longer there to be seen. We can no longer see or experience the light. That's the Alter Rebbe's position in a nutshell. The first thing I want to address about Tzimtzum Sheloi Kepshutai, the non-literal Tzimtzum, the Alter Rebbe's position. The first thing I want to address about it is that this position satisfies both of the Alter Rebbe's objections to the other position, right? That seems like a good place to start. In other words, the two reasons why the Alter Rebbe says the other position doesn't make sense, neither of them apply to the Alter Rebbe's position himself. He gets away scot-free on his two check marks, right? Number one. Let's do them in the reverse order because the second one's actually simpler. Number one, this, under the Alter Rebbe's vision, his knowledge and God's knowledge and God are absolutely one. There is no separation between God and what he knows, because where is everything? Within God's infinite expression. The infinite expression is everywhere, and everything that he knows exists within that infinite expression. So he and his knowledge are one. That was the first objection, that if it's a literal tzimtzum, then he and his knowledge would have to be separate somehow, because he is outside. He is outside of the universe, so to speak, but can see into it and be involved in what takes place there. The Alter Rebbe has God not as outside the universe. On the contrary, the universe is inside God, quote unquote, inside his expression. God's infinite light goes nowhere. And so what does he know? He knows himself, as we'll discuss at much greater length this point. But so number one, God and his knowledge are one. Number two, we also do not have attributing to God something like a body. Why? For a very simple reason. If the tzimtzum is literal, like we said before, what is the effect of the tzimtzum? The effect of the removal of the light is that we make room for a universe. And because the two of them seem to share a notion of room or space, this means that God's light is something like a spiritual or a physical being. It has something like a body, which takes up space. The Alter Rebbe's view is totally different. When the Alter Rebbe says, when the Alter Rebbe reads the Arizal, that the light has to be removed to make room for a universe, what does that mean to the Alter Rebbe? Not that the light and the universe share a concept of room or share a concept of space. The Alter Rebbe holds that the universe and God's light are non-contradictory. What's the proof? His light is still here. It doesn't go anywhere. It's a non-literal tzimtzum, right? So they do not share a space that if one is present, the other cannot be here. The Alter Rebbe says both are present, it's not a problem. The universe is here, we're here, the table's here, and the Or Ein Sof, God's infinite light, is also here. Not a problem, not a contradiction. They don't share the same notion of space. They don't share the same notion of room. Why then? Sorry?
It's like telepathy.
How is it
doesn't
like
take up space telepathy or anything, but there's that communication you can see and do stuff with.
I'm not sure I understand the connection, but I'm sorry, I was in the middle of an idea. So what then is the function of the tzimtzum? In other words, the Alter Rebbe says like this. Even without a tzimtzum, the universe could be here. There could be universes in the Ein Sof. It's not a space contradiction. It's not that if his infinite light is here, universes can't be here. The Alter Rebbe says, I believe in other Maimarim, the Alter Rebbe himself says that the God could create the universe without a tzimtzum. Not a problem. Everything could be created. The table could be here, cups could be here, human beings could be here. Everything could be here without a tzimtzum. The only difference is, what does the tzimtzum accomplish? The tzimtzum accomplishes that everything is unaware of the fact that all that it is an expression of God's infinite light. Again, what does the tzimtzum, what does the removal, so to speak, of the light accomplish to the Alter Rebbe? It's not really removed. What does the concealment of the light accomplish? Merely the ability of what is created in the light to perceive itself as something other than that light. The ability for everything to exist as a separate and independent being in its own conception is the entire effect of the tzimtzum, the entire effect of the removal of God's life. So you could have the universe exactly as it is without the tzimtzum. The only difference is that each and every thing in that universe would express God's presence fully, just as his infinite light does, right? In a qualitative sense. Everything would be seen to be. And we mean this not in a sense of consciousness, because not everything in the universe is conscious necessarily, right? But what would, in other words,
existence.
In other words, like this, you would say, and translate from the Yiddish, it's a little rough in English, but we'll try it, right? What does the table say now? The table now says, I am a table. That's what the table says, even though it's not conscious and doesn't speak. If there was no tzimtzum, the table would say God in his infinite reality. That's what the table would say, so to speak, quote unquote say. Yes? So the tzimtzum in the Alter Rebbe's conception has nothing to do with making room in a metaphysical sense for the world. The world can and does exist within his infinite light. What is the tzimtzum? What is the removal of the light? All the removal of the light does is allow everything to be itself, rather than an expression of Hashem, an expression of God in the purest sense. Okay? That's the first point I wanted to make. So therefore, to summarize the first thing I wanted to say about the non-literal tzimtzum, the Alter Rebbe fulfills his own requirements. His view does not have the two problems that the opposing view has. God and his knowledge are absolutely one because everything is within God. And the infinite light is nothing like a body because it doesn't take up the same room as the universe. The infinite light in the universe can exist in the exact same space. It's not a contradiction. Yes? The second point about the tzimtzum shalei k'pshutai, the non-literal tzimtzum. The second point is that the effect, common beginner's mistake. The point of the non-literal tzimtzum is not that God is everywhere. That is not the point of the non-literal tzimtzum. And to explain why that is not the point, I have made new copies, presents. I come bearing gifts. So take one and pass, not in Hebrew, although the original is in Hebrew, I believe, so you can go and find it.
It's here too?
No. Maybe there's a quote somewhere, I think, in there, but not the whole thing. We have here, we'll start on page 2. Number 11 is what we're looking at. We have here an English translation of a letter of the Rebbe. This is number 11 in the Alter Rebbe's entire, in the Rebbe's entire Igros. In other words, of all the printed letters of the Rebbe, this is number 11, the 11th of all. Which means, naturally, if you understand how the Rebbe's letters work, that this is from long before the Rebbe became the Rebbe. This is from many years before the Rebbe actually became the Rebbe.
Look how Tim is signed.
It is from, if you look at number 11, it says at the top, the 19th of Shvat, 5699, which is 1939. The Rebbe only became the Rebbe in 1951. So this was when the Rebbe was younger. The Rebbe, the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, I believe so.
I think it's 59.
No, sir.
It's 40 years.
I believe it's 39, sir, if I'm not mistaken. Tuf Shin is 1940, I believe.
Yes.
So this is the year before. Tuf Reish Tzadik Tes is the year before Tuf Shin.
Just put it this way, it's 80 years before he died.
It can't be 80 years before today.
57, 79, 56, 99, that's 80 years.
Anyway,
1947. No.
anyway, you can check the date. I do believe it is 1939.
Yes, correct.
The this letter was sent from the Rebbe in Paris. This is Dateline Paris, as you can see. Many years before the Rebbe became the Rebbe, before the Rebbe even moved to the United States. And the short story behind this letter, long story short, is that the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, would often refer, if he got letters asking him questions in Chassidus, he would often refer those letters to his son-in-law to answer. The Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe, even before he became the Rebbe, was helping the previous Rebbe with his payload with his workload. Of all the letters that he had to answer. So questions about learning in Torah, and especially in Chassidus, if I'm not mistaken, he let the Rebbe, his son-in-law, answer. This letter is famous, it's moderately famous even outside of Chabad circles, by the way, because the Rebbe was writing to a Lubavitcher who in turn, if I'm not mistaken, and again, I could be wrong about the details of this story, if I'm not mistaken, the Rebbe wrote this letter. This letter was sent by proxy, right? If you read it at the top, it says by number 11, this letter was addressed to Rabbi Yerachmiel Binyaminson, a distinguished rabbi from London, right? But really, Rabbi Binyaminson, who was a Lubavitcher, wrote this letter to the Rebbe, to the previous Rebbe, in the name of someone else. This letter was written with a question from Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler. You ever heard his name? If I'm not mistaken. Rabbi Dessler was the author of a book called Michtav Me'Eliyahu, which is translated in English. I believe some of the volumes are here. I forget how it's translated. Anyway, one of the great non-Hasidic rabbis in London who wrote a sefer, a very famous sefer, a very interesting work about matters of Musar, Jewish ethical living. And Rabbi Dessler had Rabbi Binyaminson write the Rebbe because they were learning and studying together about the idea of the Tzimtzum. They studied Tanya together. And Rabbi Dessler had the question, again, I could be making mistakes in the identities in this story. Sorry? Marbitzei Torah Musar, right? Rabbi Dessler had this question of, as we're going to see, what is the importance of whether the Tzimtzum is literal or non-literal? To him, it seemed that this whole debate between the Alter Rebbe and the Vilna Gaon and all the other people on both sides of this debate was essentially, it seemed to be over something very trifling. It seemed to this person that really both sides are very similar, right? And the Alter Rebbe, the Rebbe in this letter, distinguishes very clearly what the difference is between all the opinions. So let's read a bit of the letter. We're not going to read the whole thing, but you can read the rest and take it. This is your copy to keep. So on page 2, I'm just going to start from the beginning. Greetings and blessings. The letter with the enclosed $28 arrived on time. With regard to your comments concerning the Tzimtzum, the initial contraction of godly light. This is in translation from Hebrew, I believe, by the way. You can go look this up in the Rebbe's Igros, number 11, Yud Aleph, right? And the statement of your acquaintance that your acquaintance, right, this letter was sent on behalf of someone else, that all the different approaches to the concept flow in a single direction, which I believe is a translation of Eile Bekane Echad, I believe is what it's a translation of. That all of the opinions are basically saying the same thing, All the opinions are basically very similar. Says the Rebbe, I was amazed to hear such a proposition, particularly in so much as in your letter you describe that person as one who has studied Kabbalistic texts. Obviously, he does not fit that description at all. Even in the first generation after the Arizal, the one who revealed the secret of the Tzimtzum, there were radical differences in opinion among his disciples with regard to the Tzimtzum. These are obvious from the texts they compose, and these differences were perpetuated in the subsequent generations. Now, here's what the Rebbe says. This connects to what I said to preface this letter, which is the non-literal Tzimtzum doesn't mean God is everywhere. That's not what the Alter Rebbe is coming to say. That's also true, but that's not what we're coming to say here. As we will now see, the Rebbe is going to distinguish these opinions. The crux of the differences centers around two issues. There's two matters in which the rabbis speaking about these the Tzimtzum disagree. A, what's the first thing we disagree about? Should the concept of the Tzimtzum be understood literally or not? That is, are we speaking, the crux is the ikar, the center, the main thing. Should the concept of Tzimtzum be understood literally or not? That is, are we speaking about a withdrawal of light or merely its concealment, as I have been explaining to you so far this evening, right? That's the disagreement. Is the light withdrawn or is it merely concealed? B, number two, the second issue of disagreement is, did the Tzimtzum affect merely God's light or did it affect also the source of the light? That is, that he himself has withdrawn or is hidden from our world. In other words, there is actually not just a debate about the nature of the Tzimtzum, which is either is it a withdrawal or a concealment. There is also a disagreement about what is mitzamtzem, what is affected by this, whatever this action is, by this tzimtzum. There is a disagreement. Is this a contraction in his light, his expression, as I have been calling it for you, in the divine light? Is it just the light which is removed or concealed? Or is it him himself, God himself, the source of the light, who is removed or concealed from the universe, right? So there's really two disagreements in one. Number one, the nature of the tzimtzum, withdrawal versus concealment. Number two, what is it that's withdrawn / concealed? Is it God's expression or God himself? The two disagreements each have two options, which generate four positions, as the Rebbe will now enumerate on page 3. In dealing with these questions, it's thus possible to outline four different approaches, right? Because you have two options and two options, right? In the two matters of disagreement. So the four different approaches to the Tzimtzum are as follows. A, the Tzimtzum should be interpreted literally, and moreover, that it affected God's essence. The proof offered in defense of this theory is that it is impossible for the king to be found in a place of filth, heaven forbid, as we discussed last week. Right? What is removed? What is the tzimtzum? A removal. What is removed? God himself is removed. That's the first position. B, the tzimtzum should be interpreted literally, but that it affected only his light. So something is removed, but not God himself, only his presence, which is not the main position that the Alter Rebbe is arguing with, because that doesn't solve the problem of God is found in a place of filth. Right? God would still be found in a place of filth because he has not withdrawn. Only his expression has withdrawn. Right?
Is it even possible?
I don't know if it's even possible, but it's one of the possible shittas here. In other words, in the combinations of these things, I'm not sure what that means exactly. That the tzimtzum is literal but only affects his light. That's interesting. I don't think, I may be out of place saying this, I don't think that's the main position the Alter Rebbe is arguing against in Tanya. The main position the Alter Rebbe is arguing against is the first one, which is that there's a tzimtzum, a contraction, and it's God himself who is removed from the universe, right? What's the third position? The tzimtzum should not be interpreted literally, but that it affected only his light. So the tzimtzum is non-literal. It's non-literal.
It's a filter.
No, it's the third. I'm on the third.
You said it affected only his light. That's
No, it means the source of the light.
Oh, sorry, I did. I read back. You're right. Sorry. The third position, pardon me again. The third position is that the tzimtzum should not be interpreted literally, but it affected the source of light as well. So in other words, the light was concealed and God was concealed. Neither was removed from the place of the universe. D, the fourth position is that Tzimtzum should not be interpreted literally, and it affected only his light. So it's a concealment, and a concealment not of him, but of his light. This is the Alter Rebbe's position, this fourth position. So again, we have two questions. Number one, is the Tzimtzum literal? Does the Tzimtzum mean a removal or a concealment? Number two, is it of him or of his light? The Alter Rebbe says it's a concealment and of his light, not of him. That's the Alter Rebbe's position.
Because he talks about the Tzimtzum, the light, the two objects, and there are four options.
Yes, exactly. There's two things that can go two ways, so there's four options.
Logical.
Continues the Rebbe, he says, as is well known, the Misnagdim at the time of the Alter Rebbe followed the first approach mentioned. Okay, I'm glad when I said that I wasn't speaking out of turn. The first approach is the approach of the Misnagdim at the time of the Alter Rebbe. The people the Alter Rebbe is arguing with hold of the first approach, that it's literal and it affects God himself. They explain the expression, there is no place apart from him, meaning apart from his providence, right? We're going to read, when we continue reading Tanya, God willing, probably next class, we're going to read that the Alter Rebbe, there's a statement which says, Leis asar panui minei, which is from Tikkunei Zayar, which means there is no place empty of God. The Alter Rebbe reads this extremely literally. There is no place empty of God. What did the people who disagree with Alter Rebbe do with this Tikkunei Zayar? Obviously, the Vilna Gaon also knew the Tikkunei Zayar. There's no place empty of him. So how they explained it? They explained it as there's no place empty of his hashgacha. There's no place empty of his providence, right? There's nothing that he does not see or is involved in, right? But he himself is removed and distant. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. That's what the Rebbe is saying here, pardon me. I keep confusing the Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe. That's what the Rebbe is saying here.
Yeah, actually, it's a conclusion that must be.
What must be?
Otherwise, we could have said that God does not exist in this world. Because, if he took himself and he put that Tzimtzum of the light and then the world was created, that means that he actually took himself out.
That's exactly the position of the Vilna Gaon and the people with whom the Alter Rebbe is arguing. That is their position. Their position is that God himself is not present in the world. And God forbid to say that he's present in the world. It is their position.
No, but it's God by himself said that he wants to have this place for him to dwell. So he is here.
I assure you that when they interpret things, they don't interpret everything the way the Alter Rebbe interprets it. In other words, the way they would understand that is different as well. What does it mean, a dwelling place for God in the world, right? It means that the world becomes a good place, or that the world ascends in its perfection and becomes the most perfect way possible. Many ways to read it, right? In other words, the dead literal reading of all of these things is because, in other words, the same is true on the other side. The same is true on the other side. There are things that the Alter Rebbe has to read non-literally because this is his position. In other words, everybody has to make it fit somehow, right? So there's some things which read literally would disagree with Alter Rebbe. So he says those things are non-literal, right? It all depends. It all depends how you read them according to the way you understand it, which is the way Torah learning works, right? It's the exact same as when you have a Rashi and a Tosfos both reading the Gemara, both reading the Talmud. It's the exact same. They each have to read the whole page differently, right? What was this? One thinks that this line is a question. Another one thinks this line is an answer, right? There's a whole different reading according to the different modes of interpretation. So too here. In other words, the Vilna Gaon, I assure you, the Vilna Gaon had an explanation for Dira B'Tachtenim, that the Midrash says God wanted a dwelling place in the lower worlds, that doesn't involve God actually being in the lower worlds. I assure you. So when they would read, so for example, one of the things they would read non-literally is that when it says there is no place apart from him or empty of him, they would read it, nope, there's no place apart from his providence. He is in control of everything, not that he is actually present, right? That's what the Rebbe says. They said, moreover, that the approach which states that God's essence is found everywhere contradicts the laws applying to the restrictions against prayer and Torah study in places of filth, as we discussed last week. Right? They said if God is everywhere, that means God is in a restroom as well. Right? He's in places, even in places of filth. How can that be? As reflected in the notices and proclamations which were circulated at the time of the Baal Shem Tov and the Alter Rebbe, the opponents of Chassidus used this as one of their arguments, and in what they circulated in all of their letters and all of these things arguing against Chassidus, this was one of their points, that the Chassidic view would allow that for God to exist in a place of filth, which is unacceptable, as the Rebbe is writing here. See also, etc. I'm going to skip that paragraph. Fourth paragraph, Reb Chaim, the next paragraph, pardon me. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, famous student of the Vilna Gaon, did not, as I mentioned last week, did not agree with him about the Tzimtzum. The author of Nefesh HaChaim, which you mentioned in your letter, follows the third approach mentioned above. They followed the third approach. The third approach is that the Tzimtzum is non-literal, but it affects also the source of light. That when
It was literal. It affects only
the C,
Yes.
C. The Tzimtzum is not literal,
Should not be interrupted.
but it affected the source of light as well.
Yes.
In other words, not only does the Alter Rebbe disagree with the Vilna Gaon's position, which is that there was a literal removal and not just a concealment, and of what? Of God. That's the Vilna Gaon's position, God himself. The Alter Rebbe also disagrees with Reb Chaim Volozhiner, who has a much closer position to the Alter Rebbe, because he agrees that the Tzimtzum is non-literal. He agrees that it's not a removal, it's only a concealment. But Reb Chaim of Volozhin says in his Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, which is in some ways very similar to and influenced by the Tanya, Reb Chaim of Volozhin says that not only was God's light removed, but God himself was removed from the place of concealed. Not only was his light concealed, but God himself was concealed from the universe in the act of the Tzimtzum. That's the disagreement. So the disagreement between Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Alter Rebbe is a narrow one. Rav Chaim Volozhiner says that Tzimtzum hid God from the universe. Alter Rebbe says that Tzimtzum only concealed his light from the universe, only his expression, not him himself. That's the entire disagreement between the Alter Rebbe and Rav Chaim Volozhiner, right? One of the top students of the Vilna Gaon, who the Alter Rebbe is bringing up because the letter that was written to him brought up Rav Chaim of Volozhin. In this, continues the Rebbe, he differs from his master, the Gaon Rav Eliyahu of Vilna. In general, it appears that Rav Chaim of Volozhin had seen Chabad texts, in particular the Tanya, and had been influenced by them. I do not, however, have definite proof of this, says the Rebbe. The Rebbe thinks that he was influenced by Chabad, that he doesn't have any proof to prove it. As Chassidim, says the Rebbe, we follow solely the fourth approach mentioned, which explains that the concept of Tzimtzum should not be interpreted literally, and that it affects only God's light, but not the source of light. Indeed, within the light, it affects only the lowest level of the light which existed before the Tzimtzum, as explained in the texts and manuscripts of Chabad teachings. That's Ad Kan. That's what I'm going to read in this letter.
But they're both valid.
All four positions are valid, if they're rabbis that held them.
Arguable. But there's another problem. In one hand, we said that Owen Sof is actually God, because otherwise, how would you describe God?
What do you mean?
God, Owen Sof.
Godliness.
I'm glad you asked. Excellent question. What does the Alter Rebbe hold about God himself? Let's discuss this. We started 10 minutes late, so I'm going to go 10 minutes over with everyone's indulgence. What does the Alter Rebbe say about God himself, right? In other words, what we have now arrived at, what you get from this letter, and I recommend everyone read it again to just get clear on the Rebbe summarizes very briefly but very clearly the positions here in what the distinctions are. What we get from this letter is that there is a distinction between God himself and God's expression. And the only thing that the Alter Rebbe is describing here, when he is talking about this concealment, this non-literal removal, this non-literal tzimtzum, the concealment, it's only about God's light and not about God. God did not undergo a tzimtzum, according to the Alter Rebbe. There is no such thing. God did not undergo a tzimtzum. So we have here a difference. There is God, and there is his expression, his infinite light, what we call Or Ein Sof. God, the infinite light, the light without end. So there's God, and there's his light. The distinction in Chassidus, in the way of the Alter Rebbe, is as follows. This deserves far more than 10 minutes. We're probably going to have to talk about it next time as well. In review, we're going to have to review thoroughly. The difference between God and his life, his light. First of all, the first thing to get over in understanding the difference between God and his light is the idea that God exists. This is the first thing that must be gotten over. This has been mentioned in our class before, right? The first thing to understand is that God does not exist. In what sense does God not exist? In every sense of the word exist, right? As the Rambam explains, this is not a crazy controversial Chabad teaching. This goes back to the Middle Ages. You can Google it. It's in Mar Nevuchim. What does the Guide for the Perplexed, what do we say? We say that no words apply to God himself. There are no words that describe God himself, because all words work in a way of analogy. When we say that God exists, we mean that he shares something in common with everything else that exists, in that they all exist. Chassidus says differently, the Alter Rebbe says differently, and the Rambam, when he is in this mode, when he describes God in this way, also disagrees. The Rambam is in some senses self-contradictory unless you really work to understand it. The Rambam's conception of God varies over the Guide for the Perplexed, so it can become quite confusing. Part of what the Rebbe did, again, made the mistake again, part of what the Rebbe did in some of his deepest talks was try and untangle the Rambam's view of God and Chassidus' view of God and make it all make sense, which is quite something. But that's all parenthetical. The main point is that no words can describe God himself, including the fact that he exists. If you say that he exists, if you say that he is nimtza, which means that he exists, more or less, there are better translations, but we don't have time. If you say that he is nimtza, that he exists, what you mean is that he exists in the way that anything else exists. This the Alter Rebbe rejects. We reject this position. He does not exist in the way that anything else exists. God himself does not exist in the way that anything else exists. No words can describe him. No words apply to him whatsoever. He is what's called a metzias bilti metzias nimtza, which is a language, if not taken directly from the Rambam, a slight reworking of the Rambam's language. A metzias bilti...
more like presence.
I'm translating as exist. There's better translations, but this is what I'm telling you, the Nakuda is true. In other words, we could quibble on the language. The Nakuda is correct. He's a Metzias bilti Metzias nimtza, which means he is an existence, but not an existing existence. That's what the phrase means. What does this mean? What does this mean? What does this mean? We cannot say, God forbid, that God doesn't exist. God must exist. So therefore he's in existence. But what is the eifen? What is the way in which he exists? A non-existing existence. Because to say he's an existing existence means that he shares existence with everything else that exists, which is incorrect. So he is a metzias bilti metzias nimtza, an existence who exists in a way of not existing.
But I guess this is the way Rambam likes to define things, like what is God knowledge? It doesn't lack any knowledge. This is
shlila, exactly. This is a negation.
The only way
exactly. The only thing we can say is that he doesn't not exist. Right? But even that, in other words, the point I'm trying to make is when we say he doesn't not exist, that is very far from saying that he exists. Right? He exists is categorizing him. Right? All we can say is that what we're really saying is that we cannot attribute to him non-existence either. You can't say he doesn't exist. You can't say he does exist. What can you say? You shouldn't say. You should be quiet. Right? That's the lesson. Right? The lesson is the way the Rebbe Rashab says it. I forget the exact language, it was very, very beautiful. Essentially, that God himself, he negates everything that's positive, and he negates all negation as well. Right? In other words, it's not just that you can't affirmatively say what he is, you also can't in the negative say what he is either. You can't say what he isn't either. Right? Because there is literally no definition to God. You cannot say what he is, you cannot say what he isn't. Now, if that's the case, let's pick two words. Let's say revealed and concealed. Right? Can God himself be concealed? And the answer is, the question doesn't make sense. You can only conceal something which can be revealed, just like you can only exist something which does not exist, right? Which is non-existent, right? Or in other words, the whole idea of concealment, the Alter Rebbe would say, only applies to something which can be experienced, which can be known, which can be revealed. So when we say there's a tzimtzum and something is concealed, a non-literal tzimtzum, something is concealed, says the Alter Rebbe, that clearly does not apply to God. God is neither concealed nor revealed. God is just God, right?
It could also even be a sin to say that you can actually conceal God. Because otherwise, you take God and make it smaller. It's impossible.
Concealment is not the same as making smaller. Concealment means that he can't be perceived by anything outside of himself.
Which is true. Because if you're dativ, of course you cannot.
That's kind of what we're saying. Yeah, that's kind of what we're saying. We're kind of saying that if you knew God, you would be God. That's kind of what we're saying. Yes, that if you were to really know him, you could only be him. You could only be him. There is no such thing as knowing God from outside of God, right? But it's really deeper than that. It's really deeper than that. The whole idea of knowing does not even really apply. Just like no other ideas apply. There is no mode, there is no method by which to approach God, because he shares nothing in common with anything else.
The only way you can approach God then is viscerally.
There is no approach to God. The whole thing doesn't make sense. There's nothing to approach. Approaching means I'm further away and I'm getting closer. How can you be further away and get closer? He's not defined by any limits.
The word approach.
Right. Well, what the Alter Rebbe says is that God, the language of the Alter Rebbe elsewhere in Torah is that Adarabba hama'or hu behisgalus, which means, on the contrary, the source of the light is revealed everywhere. The source of the light is revealed everywhere. In other words, the Alter Rebbe's position is that not only is there no concealing God, but God is actually present everywhere always. In other words, the idea that God is everywhere, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere, as we learn in Sunday school, the song, right? That song is not about tzimtzum literal, tzimtzum non-literal, that his light is everywhere. That song is about God himself, and God himself is essentially everywhere and nowhere. He is essentially everywhere and nowhere. Right? No words can actually define where he is, where he isn't, what he is, what he isn't. And that Alter Rebbe says, this is the reason why, don't ask me to explain this, because I don't fully understand it myself. This is the reason why, says the Alter Rebbe, Shem Shamayim Shogur Befiko. This, Afilu HaTinokus, the name of heaven is in the mouth of everyone, even small children. In other words, says the Alter Rebbe, everyone really knows God in this sense. God himself, everyone knows. It's just that because he is totally non-defined, you don't know that you know him. But Shem Shamayim Shogar Befiko. The name of heaven is in the mouth of everyone. In other words, even children, even small children who have never been educated about God, know God and show familiarity with God. They speak of God, even though they don't know that that's what they know. Because he's everywhere. Omnipresent in this sense. He's present in everything, obviously, but in a way that is totally non-defined. Right? So the tzimtzum, when we say that the tzimtzum is non-literal, the Alter Rebbe is actually saying something far more bold. He's not just saying that God is everywhere. That's a given, obviously. How could he not be everywhere and nowhere, right? There's no defining, limiting, there's no such thing, right? He's not shaykh, he has no connection, no relationship to these concepts, right? When the Alter Rebbe is saying that the tzimtzum is non-literal, the point he's making is not that God himself is everywhere, but even his presence is everywhere. Even his presence, even his infinite light is everywhere as well. His infinite light is everywhere. What's the difference between him and his light? His light is the thing that exists that expresses God. Again, the difference between him and his infinite light is that the light is the thing that exists that expresses God. No, exists, metzius. It's nimtza. The way we said God does not exist because no words apply to him. The light is everything that God is expressed. What do we mean by expressed? It exists. It exists.
Right, it's like, I think we spoke before, it's like perfume and the form and the smell that you smell out of the perfume. It's not the thing itself, it's like what comes out of it.
So, what does this mean? We'll have to explain this much more next time, God willing. But what does this mean? What is the Alter Rebbe really getting at with the non-literal Tzimtzum? Not only is God everywhere in his totally undefined and indescribable and logically contradictory essence, not only is that everywhere, right? That's obviously everywhere because nothing can contradict it, right? How can you contradict something that has no definition? There's no contradiction, right? He can be everywhere. He can be within everything. Nothing stands in his way, so to speak.
Even contradictions.
Even contradictions.
And the contradiction is exactly the same thing.
Exactly. They're exactly the same. They're both godly. It's all godly, right? But not only is he everywhere in that sense, right? Which is a very strange sense of everywhere that we probably can't even understand, very likely, right? So he's everywhere in the sense that nothing contradicts him and he has no definition and therefore he's everywhere, whatever that means. Even saying that he has no definition is itself a definition, right? Pertaining to God, right? Go figure, you can go think about that one. Anyway, it's his light that is also everywhere. His light, which is unlike him, is an existence. It's an existence. That itself is also everywhere. Something, the expression of God about which you can say affirmative things, such as it was revealed or it was concealed, that divine expression which exists is also everywhere. In other words, this is really the idea which we will, God willing, begin with next time, which is the idea of Yichud Seive V'Memale, as it's called in Chassidus, that his infinite light and his finite light are one. Or a different term for it is Havaya Ve'Elokim Kulachad. God in his infinite expression and God in his limited expression are absolutely one. Or in other words, what is the defined and limited world in which we exist? All it is his infinite light. His infinite light has not gone anywhere, right? And the fact is that to truly understand the whole point of the whole Shaar HaYichud V'Emunah, the whole point of the whole Shaar HaYichud V'Emunah that the Alter Rebbe is getting at, which is that the world is absolutely not separate from God at all, you have to understand this point as well, which is the point that not only is he in the world in the sense that he is constantly speaking it into existence and all the world is the divine speech, which itself, all that is included within its source, and all that is one with him, right? So not only is the world a finite and defined nothing other than God, the world is also, at the same time, simultaneously, an infinite expression of God. An infinite expression of God. The world is found within and is part of and is simply an extension of the infinite expression of Hashem. Not only is the world a finite expression of godliness on its own terms, not only is it merely the divine speech, the limited divine speech which creates each and everything, but what is that divine speech in addition to being limited and defined and the soul of each and everything as it is to itself? In addition to that, the world is also merely part of his infinite expression. The world is this is the real Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi. What is the world? There is nothing here other than the infinite light which was always here. The Tzimtzum is non-literal. The infinite light went nowhere. That's literally our entire existence is within this infinite expression of God. And the reason why and this is a chiddush, this is an innovation that the Alter Rebbe has to teach us, because nothing can contradict God, because God himself is beyond all contradiction. you could think that something could contradict his infinite light, though, because his infinite light is an existence. His infinite light is in existence. And what the Alter Rebbe is basically coming to tell you is that the appearance of other existences here is only an appearance, created by the Tzimtzum, which is the concealment of this existence, the concealment of the existence of his infinite light. So that's, in a nutshell, the Tzimtzum Shaloi Kipshutei. That is the non-literal Tzimtzum. The position that the Alter Rebbe is arguing against is that the Tzimtzum is literal. To make room for a world, you have to remove the infinite expression of God. The Alter Rebbe's idea of Tzimtzum is on the contrary. What was the Tzimtzum? What does the Tzimtzum do? All the Tzimtzum does is let one aspect or one part of his infinite light perceive itself to be something other than an aspect of his infinite light. But that is not the truth of the thing. The truth of the thing, even in its own terms, even if I want to say the truth of the table, not how God sees everything as absolutely nothing, which we already discussed, right? From God's perspective. The table's perspective, what does the table actually say? The table says the infinite expression of God. And that is a chidush, and that is what the Alter Rebbe is talking about here. That is what the Alter Rebbe is talking about here in this chapter of Tanya, and the second half of chapter 7, that the Tzimtzum is non-literal. The Tzimtzum is not a removal of the light. It's almost the exact opposite. It's what allows limited things to exist within the light. It's the opposite of a removal of the light. It's or a removal of God. God is everywhere, and his infinite light is everywhere, even though the universe is here. And the universe is nothing other than an expression of his infinite light, as we'll discuss more, God willing, next time.